You think you know what life looked like when Jesus walked the earth. You've seen the paintings, the soft light, the clean robes, the peaceful hillsides. But strip all of that away, and what remains would shock you into silence. What if a single, ordinary morning in first-century Galilee exposed everything you assumed was simple as something far more fragile, more brutal, and more deeply human than you ever imagined? What if the world Jesus moved through every day was a place where one wrong decision, one missed harvest, one broken tool, one contaminated well, could end a family's life within a season? What if understanding that world, truly understanding it, changed not just how you read the Gospels, but how you hear every single word Jesus ever said? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the God who chose to enter this exact world, not a comfortable one. The first thing you need to understand is that the early first century in Roman-occupied Galilee was not a backdrop. It was a pressure system, a weight carried on every body, every single day. If you had been born into that world, not as a Roman citizen, not as a wealthy merchant in Caesarea, but as a common Jewish laborer in a village like Capernaum or Nazareth, your morning would begin before sunrise, not with an alarm, but with the sound of animals, the smell of smoke, and the immediate, unforgiving demand of survival. The house you woke up in was not what the word house suggests to a modern mind. It was a single-room stone structure, low-ceilinged, dark even at midday, shared not just with your immediate family, but frequently with a second family, sometimes a grandparent, sometimes a brother's household, and almost certainly with your livestock at night. The animals were not kept outside by choice. They were kept inside for warmth and for protection. Their body heat was a resource. Their safety was your economic survival. If you enjoyed this kind of historical depth, the kind that makes the Bible come alive in ways no Sunday sermon can quite reach, consider subscribing to this channel. There's much more of this waiting for you, and every video is built to take you deeper. The floor beneath your feet was packed earth, occasionally covered with reeds or straw. There was no chimney in the way we understand it. Smoke from the cooking fire drifted upward through a hole or simply filled the upper portion of the room before escaping. Your eyes adjusted, your lungs adjusted. You had no other option. The smell of that room. Smoke, animals, sweat, dried grain, and the particular sharpness of olive oil burning in a clay lamp was not something you noticed anymore. It was simply the smell of being alive. And that lamp, that small clay vessel with a wick soaked in oil pressed from local olives, was not decoration. It was the boundary between safety and darkness, between function and helplessness. When the oil ran out before dawn, work stopped. Children stumbled, accidents happened. One lamp, carefully managed, was a form of power, and you had to earn the oil to fill it. To earn anything in first-century Galilee, you worked with your body. There was no other mechanism. If you were a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, that freshwater lake the locals called Yam Kinneret, the harp-shaped sea, your day began in the darkness before dawn, when the water was coldest and the nets heaviest. Fishing was not a romantic occupation. It was a guild, a system, a tax-burdened enterprise that required boats, nets, salt, partners, and a license extracted by Roman authorities who cared nothing about whether the catch was good or poor. The tax was owed regardless. The nets themselves were a family's most valuable physical possession. Woven from flax or hemp, heavy when wet, prone to tearing on submerged rocks, they required constant maintenance. Every evening that was not spent on the water was spent on the shore, fingers moving through knotted fibers in fading light, repairing what the lake had damaged. A torn net left unrepaired was income lost. Income lost in that economy was not inconvenience. It was hunger. It was the inability to pay the tribute demanded by Rome, the temple tax demanded by Jerusalem, and the debt owed to whoever had extended credit during the last lean season. Debt, in that world, was not an abstraction. It was a physical condition. It followed families across generations. It determined who ate first, who ate less, and who did not eat at all. A man who fell behind on his obligations could lose his land, the land his father had worked and his father before him. Without land, without a boat, without a trade, a man became a day laborer. He stood in the village square at dawn, waiting for someone to hire him for a denarius, 1 day's wage, enough to buy the grain his family needed for that single day. Not more, exactly that. This is the world in which Jesus told a story about a landowner who went out at dawn, at mid-morning, at noon, at mid-afternoon, and even at the final hour of the working day to hire men still standing in the square. Modern readers sometimes focus on the generosity of the equal wage. But the first audience heard something else first. They heard the desperation in the image of men still waiting at the 11th hour. Those men had not been lazy. They had been standing there all day, in the heat, watching others get chosen, calculating how to explain to their families why they were coming home with nothing. The parable did not begin with theology. It began with a scene every listener recognized in their own bones, because in that economy, everything operated on the razor's edge between enough and catastrophe. The grain stored in clay jars sealed with cloth and pressed lids was not surplus. It was the margin between surviving the next month and appealing to the mercy of a relative who might or might not have anything left to give. Grain weevils were not a minor nuisance. They were a threat to survival. Mold in the storage jar was not inconvenience, it was crisis. A woman discovering spoilage in her household's grain would not simply go to the market. She would calculate, ration, consider, and perhaps go to sleep that night in genuine fear about what the coming week would demand. And she would wake before sunrise and do it again. The weight of that repetition, the unbroken, unrelenting cycle of labor, scarcity, obligation, and physical exposure, was the texture of ordinary life. Not poverty in the exceptional sense. Ordinary life, the life of the vast majority of the people Jesus walked among, ate with, touched, and addressed directly. Water was the first problem every morning. Not coffee, not breakfast, water. In villages across Galilee, there was no private well for every household. There was a communal source, a spring, a cistern carved from limestone bedrock, a collecting pool fed by seasonal rain, and access to it was a social event as much as a practical one. Women carried the water, not because men were exempt by law, but because water collection was woven into the fabric of female domestic responsibility in a way that was total and unquestioned. The vessel used, a large clay jar, carried on the head or balanced on the hip, could weigh, when full, between 20 and 40 pounds. The walk from source to home could be several minutes or significantly longer, depending on the village's layout and the season's water table. This was not done once a day. It was done as many times as the household required. Cooking, washing, drinking, the soaking of dried legumes, the preparation of dough. All of it consumed water that had to be physically carried by a human body across stone paths and uneven ground, in summer heat that could reach brutal intensities, in winter cold that made wet hands a source of real pain. Now consider what it meant when Jesus, sitting beside Jacob's well in Samaria, a well with a history stretching back to the patriarchs, a well deep enough that drawing from it required a rope and a vessel, spoke to a woman who had come alone at midday when no other women were present. The social signal of that timing was not subtle to anyone listening. Women collected water together in the cooler morning hours, in groups. A woman alone at noon was a woman who could not afford to be seen with the others. Whatever her history, and the Gospel of John makes it complicated, she had arranged her life to avoid the gathered eyes of her community. She came when the well was empty of witnesses, and Jesus was sitting there, waiting, it seems, in the full heat of the day. He asked her for water, not because he could not find another source, but because the request itself crossed a boundary that everyone in that culture understood immediately. A Jewish man did not address an unknown woman in public. A Jewish man did not request anything from a Samaritan. The two peoples shared a geography and a divided ancestry and centuries of mutual contempt. The disciples, when they returned and found him speaking with her, did not ask what he wanted or why she was there. The gospel says simply that they were astonished and that none of them dared to ask the question forming in all of their minds. What the woman said next reveals how completely she understood the weight of the moment. She did not answer his request. She named the violation. "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" She was not being rude. She was being precise. She was identifying clearly and without apology the exact nature of what had just happened. Because in that world, being precise about social boundaries was not pedantry, it was survival. It was the mechanism by which honor was maintained, shame was avoided, and communities held their internal order. Honor and shame were not abstract values in first-century Jewish and Samaritan culture. They were currencies. A man's honor, and by extension his family's honor, determined his access to credit, to alliances, to marriage negotiations, to the basic cooperative relationships that made survival possible in a subsistence economy. Shame was not embarrassment. It was exclusion. And exclusion, in a world without social safety nets, without hospitals, without state welfare, was a sentence that could end in genuine destitution. The woman at the well was already carrying that sentence. She had been carrying it long enough that she had restructured her entire daily routine around avoiding the moment when it might be spoken aloud. And into that precise, specific, historically situated human condition, Jesus spoke about living water. Disease moved through first-century Galilee the way wind moves through a field, invisibly, without warning, and without regard for how carefully a family had worked to protect itself. There was no germ theory. There was no understanding of contagion in the modern sense. What existed instead was a complex, ancient system of purity and impurity. A framework encoded in the Torah, interpreted by generations of rabbis, and woven so deeply into daily life that it governed not just religious practice, but every physical interaction between human bodies. A person declared ritually impure could not enter the temple, could not participate in communal worship, could not touch certain objects, certain people, certain foods. The declaration of impurity was not always a moral judgment. Sometimes it was simply a medical and social classification, a response to skin disease, to bodily discharge, to contact with death. But the practical consequences were identical, regardless of the cause. Impurity meant separation, and separation in a world built entirely on communal interdependence meant a form of living death. Leprosy, or rather, the broad category of skin conditions the Hebrew word zara'at described, was the most severe form of this sentence. A person diagnosed by the priest was required to tear their clothing, leave their hair unbound, cover their upper lip, and call out "unclean, unclean" as a warning to anyone who might approach. They lived outside the village, outside the walls, outside the system of relationships, obligations, and protections that made ordinary life possible. They could not work in the normal economy. They could not touch their children. They could not sit at a table with their family. They existed in a category that was simultaneously alive and socially erased. When a man with leprosy approached Jesus on a Galilean road, an act that was itself a violation of the separation he was required to maintain, and said, "If you are willing, you can make me clean," he was not making a simple medical request. He was making a statement of total vulnerability. He was placing his entire remaining dignity, his last coherent hope, into a single sentence spoken to a traveling rabbi who had no institutional authority to do anything about his condition. The healing, if it came, would need to be confirmed by a priest. It would need to move through the existing system. Jesus acknowledged this. He told the man to show himself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded. But before any of that, before the institutional process, before the confirmation, before the reintegration into community, Jesus did something the text records with 3 words that carry the full weight of that world's social architecture. He reached out his hand, and he touched him, in a culture where impurity transferred through physical contact, where touching the unclean made the clean person unclean, where an entire population had been conditioned since childhood to maintain physical distance from this category of human being. Jesus touched him first, before speaking the healing, before the outcome was visible. He closed the distance that the entire social and religious system had constructed and maintained, and he made contact with a body that no one had voluntarily touched in what may have been years. This was not a rhetorical gesture. It was not symbolic in the thin, decorative sense the word sometimes carries. It was a physical act performed in a specific cultural moment, and every person who witnessed it understood immediately and precisely what had just happened. The teacher had made himself technically impure in order to reach a man whom impurity had made invisible. That is the world Jesus inhabited. Not a world of soft paintings and peaceful hillsides, a world of packed earth floors and 40-pound water jars. A world of unpaid debts and 11th-hour desperation. A world where a woman restructured her day around a well to avoid her neighbor's eyes, and where a man called out unclean on the road so that living people would treat him as though he were already gone. Jesus did not descend into that world from a comfortable distance. He walked its roads in sandals, worn by the same dust. He sat beside its wells in the same heat. He touched what that world had declared untouchable, spoke to those it had rendered invisible, and told stories built entirely from the materials of ordinary survival: seeds, nets, lamps, bread, coins, and the specific weighted anxiety of not having enough. To read the Gospels without that world is to read words on a page. To read them with it is to hear a voice speaking from inside the full weight of human experience. Not above it, not around it, but from within it, where the light is hardest to find and therefore most necessary.